Transform Transportation, Privatization of the New York City Subway System. In 2019, a BBC docuseries entitled World's Busiest Cities revealed the inner workings of the Moscow subway. Host Dan Snow, a historian, and Anita Rani, a reporter, noted that during rush hour, a train stops in the station every minute and a half. The Tokyo metro system offers a subway pass that doubles as electronic money and is considered the most efficient in the world. Rail transit is now heavily used in cities to move massive amounts of people. But one megacity has had subway issues for years, New York City. New York City's metro system has suffered from overcrowding, outdated equipment, and delays. This poor performance leads to the question, should the New York City rail transit system be privatized? I'm Claire Devinney, and my research has led me to the conclusion the New York City rail transit system would benefit from an increased efficiency and environmental and social awareness if it were privatized. According to Emma Fitzsimmons, a New York Times transportation correspondent, the New York City system has experienced increased delays. In 2012, the system had about 28,000 delays per month. Recently, the number of delays can be up to 70,000 per month. These delays are mostly due to overcrowding and systems malfunctions. Todd Newcomb, senior editor of Government Technology, points out that ticket fares have risen despite poor service. From an economic perspective, the New York City rail transit system has suffered from inefficient infrastructure spending and usage of taxpayer dollars. Privatizing it would increase its efficiency and improve its infrastructure, causing more New Yorkers to use rail transit. Clifford Winston, a senior fellow of the Economic Studies Division at the Brookings Institution, notes that public transit was originally a private industry. Winston posits that public rail transit could once again be privatized to become a less expensive alternative to automobile travel. Robert Fellner, a director at the Nevada Policy Research Institute, argues for the privatization of the New York City rail transit system from its current administration, the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA. Fellner notes that the current public system uses signaling technology from the 1930s, despite having spent more than $100 billion on infrastructure since the 1980s. Furthermore, MTA doesn't anticipate updating the system for another 50 years. He also notes that MTA infrastructure spending was 90% below private systems, mostly due to public pressure to fund popular projects such as slightly larger subway cars instead of infrastructure. Such misuse of funds indicates that the New York City rail transit system would benefit from the efficiency that private companies must hone to stay in business. Privatizing the New York City Metro would improve its efficiency, thus enticing more customers to use the system. From an environmental standpoint, increased usage of this subway system that would result from privatization would lessen transportation pollution in New York City. In a 1989 speech to the United Nations, Prime Minister of the United Kingdom Margaret Thatcher emphasized the necessity for every country to play a role in fighting climate change, stating, "We must use science to cast a light ahead so that we can move step by step in the right direction." Rail transit is a tactic for New York City to decrease its pollution levels and fulfill its responsibility to safeguard the earth. MTA notes that although transportation accounts for 29% of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, rail transit produces little to no air pollution because systems run on electricity rather than gasoline. According to the MTA budget for 2018 through 2021, 34% of the New York City rail transit system funding during that time comes from dedicated taxes. 8% of the budget comes from state and local subsidies. In total, between 2018 and 2021, MTA will use $6,601,000 of government money. Privatizing the system would lessen the strain on taxpayers. Although a private system might charge higher fares, ticket prices would only economically affect transit riders rather than taxing citizens regardless of their usage of the subway system. A study by Douglas Dockery, a member of the Environmental Epidemiology program of the Department of Environmental Health at Harvard School of Public Health, shows a positive correlation between increased mortality and level of air pollution in cities. Efficient private systems would stimulate higher rates of use, lessening pollution from other less environmentally sound transport options and protecting the health of New Yorkers who could be harmed by pollution. Opponents of privatization argue that transit companies would operate for their own benefit rather than the benefit of customers. Ronald Klain, former chief of staff to both Al Gore and Joe Biden, argues that against privatization on the grounds that it shifts decisions about city planning and infrastructure to companies like Uber and Lyft instead of the government. Klain points out that private companies are not obligated to take action to protect the accessibility of senior and disabled citizens, as well as the population at large, the way that the government is. However, what Klain fails to realize is that government-funded systems are even less accountable to consumers than private corporations. If a private company disappoints its customers, it will lose business and eventually either improve or shut down. If a government-funded system disappoints citizens, nothing happens. The system will continue to be funded by tax money whether or not anyone uses it. This setup allows government inefficiency to take place without penalization. Alex Marshall, a senior fellow with the Regional Plan Association in New York City, published a list of technology and infrastructure improvements that could be made to the New York City rail transit system to make users safer and more comfortable riding the subway. The list includes digital high-resolution video cameras to deter theft or harassment in rail transit stations and cars, and sliding glass walls to prevent passengers from falling or jumping onto the tracks and being hit by a train. These changes should be the responsibility of the government funding the system to consider in the best interest of their users, but the lack of urgency resulting from tax funding doesn't require such investments. One solution to the problems with the New York City rail transit system could be private companies building monorails or light rail transit systems, which are above ground and carry less people than underground metro systems. Implications would include reduced necessity for private companies to build underground systems, which are extremely expensive. Limitations of this solution include the expense to build light rail or monorail systems, which are less costly than metro systems, but still more than most private companies might want to take on. Also, light rail or monorail systems could take up considerable city real estate. In his book Last Exit, Privatization and Deregulation of the U.S. Transportation System, Clifford Winston should suggest experiments in small regions to test scalable privatization. Eventually, programs that work could be extended to the entirety of the New York City system. This solution might be difficult because it requires separation of a small part of the system to work, and the New York City rail transit system is interconnected. However, this could be overcome by using separate route lines to test system alterations. This experiment would allow MTA to cede control of rail transit systems to private companies that are interested in entering the transportation industry. Such tests would allow the assessment of private control of rail transit and eventually justify the total privatization of the New York City rail transit system, improving the economy, environmental sustainability, and society of New York City. Thank you.
Claire, all right, thank you. Okay, so the first of two questions. How did you select the strategies you used to gather information or conduct research? Were they effective for you?
My strategy was to look into information provided by the MTA to determine how the subway worked, and then find sources that explained how those workings could be improved. For example, I found the MTA 2018 through 2021 budget that showed how much money was being used on the system, and then I was able to use the policy analysis of Robert Fellner and Clifford Winston to determine that such money could be used in other places, and that the subway would be cheaper if it were by a private company.
Okay, thanks. Second question. What advice would you have for other researchers who consider the same topic?
My advice to other researchers would be to have a solid baseline of knowledge of the history of the transit system researched before starting on solutions. Also, I would suggest looking at a more international perspective. For example, I looked at the Tokyo and Moscow systems. The Tokyo system is privatized, and it's considered the most efficient in the world. And they also have a lot more systems than New York City does. So that was a good source for privatization. However, the Moscow subway is also very efficient, and it's public. So it was good to have different and somewhat competing international viewpoints to establish a baseline of knowledge about how subway systems around the world work. And also, it was nice to have, I would suggest having a local perspective. For example, in Lancaster City, there's a train station which carries commuters to Philly, and it had a renovation around 2009, but before that time it had kind of a reputation for disrepair. And I thought it would be interesting to see with my solution if privatization would improve that. So to other researchers, I would suggest a strong grip of history of whichever system you're researching, a strong knowledge about international systems around the world and how they work, and ideas about local subway systems and how your solution could be implemented on a smaller and more local community-based scale.
Okay, well, thank you.